There are hundreds of basic and alternate recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. Some of them are absolutely amazing, whilst others not so much. So I've made it my mission in Satisfactory to compare every single recipe in the game to inform you guys on what the best and worst recipes are. So welcome to the best recipes in Satisfactory 1.0 series. Today's video is all about the radio control unit. First, you might be thinking, well, why do I have to use this thing? Well, let me quickly show you. This radio control unit that has 3 recipes, which I'll break down in just a minute, is required to make turbo motors. It's also used to make the conversion cube, which of course is very, very important in the nuclear pasta recipe, which is another space elevator part. It's also used in the supercomputer, and is also an alternate recipe for the turbo electric motor, which of course is just another turbo motor. So it's safe to say that this thing is relatively important. And when it comes to the recipe for this thing, let's take a closer look. There's 3 recipes in total. There's the radio control unit, which requires aluminium casing, crystal oscillators, and computers. There's then the radio control system, which requires crystal oscillators, circuit boards, aluminium casing, and rubber. And lastly, there's the radio connection unit, which requires heat sinks, high-speed connectors, and quartz crystals. And just like what I did for the computers and heavy modular frames, I have laid out all 3 of these recipes, and we are going to break it down bit by bit to show you exactly what is needed. I do use some very interesting alternate recipes, but I'll explain everything as we go along. So if you'd like more of these tutorials, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel. All support's greatly appreciated, and I've got tons more Satisfactory videos coming out soon. Thank you. So let's start with the basic recipe. And for all 3 of these alternate and basic recipes, we'll be calculating 5 per minute. This makes the experiment nice and fair. And to make the 5 radio control units, you are going to be needing 80 aluminium casing, 2.5 crystal oscillators, and lastly, 5 computers. And let's start with these 5 computers. As I've already explained in the introduction, I've made a video talking about this, and this is my favorite computer recipe in the game. It requires crystal oscillators, reinforced iron plates, and 7.5 circuit boards. And the reason as to why I love it is because these are the only items you need to make these 5 computers. Less than 40 copper ore, 100 water, but that's relatively simple to get, a few raw quartz, and just 41 iron ore. I love this recipe, but I would like to explain something very quickly that I always explain in these videos. The reason as to why I don't use much ore is because I use pure ingot recipes. If you want, you don't have to use any water that you see here. However, the reason as to why I use it is because you end up saving so many ores. So if you are trying to save ores, do this. If you're trying to save power, don't do this. Just do this basic recipe here, which would mean that this will then have to go up to 56.25 iron ore, which will replicate this into a 1-to-1 ratio. But that's your choice, that is completely up to you. Personally, I prefer doing this, but again, this is my personal preference, do whatever best suits you. So that's computers out the way with. Now let's hit up the crystal oscillators, where again, luckily we only need 2.5 per minute, which is the exact same amount as the 2.5 we need for our computer. So in theory, if you are going to be using this recipe, you might as well just make 5 crystal oscillators, then split it so that 2.5 comes into here, then 2.5 goes into your computers. Such a simple recipe. Just needing your quartz crystals, cable, and of course, reinforced iron plates, which again, doesn't require that much of at all. The final part is the aluminium casings, where you're going to need 80 of these per minute. To make the casing, I use 120 aluminium ingots, which is then used from 240 aluminium scrap, which also gives you 80 water per minute. And I do pronounce it as aluminium, but you might pronounce it as aluminum. It's still the exact same resource. So, to make the 240 aluminium or aluminum scrap, you then need 160 aluminum solution, combined with 80 coal per minute. This might sound like a lot, but it's not the most coal you'll be using in today's video. Lastly, you then need bauxite and water. I don't mind using water, but I do try and save out a bit on bauxite, and I think this recipe overall, as you're about to see, isn't too bad. for the bauxite consumption. And essentially, that is it for our basic radio control unit recipe. This is the overall resources you are using and also getting in return. As you can see, we are actually making 80 water, but we're consuming 302. This number does not include the water you get back, so if you are going to re-add the water into the system, it will then lower this down to 222.4 water per minute rather than 302. You're only using 80 coal, 62.6 copper, 126 raw quartz, which isn't really that much, considering you have like 13,000 around the map, 82 iron ore, again you've got like 40,000 of this thing lying around, and 0 crude oil. You might be wondering, why have I got crude oil written down here? Well, all will be explained in our third recipe. But for now, let's hit up our second recipe, which is the radio connection unit. And as usual, we're making 5 per minute to keep this experiment nice and fair. Starting off with the 20 heat sinks, and this is going to set you back quite a few resources. Firstly, we've got our copper sheets. If you weren't to use these 2 water recipes like I was showing you guys earlier, this would mean that you'd have to consume about 120 copper ore, but because of the recipes I use, you're only consuming 24. This is the reason as to why I do it. But rather than using 1 constructor or 2 constructors in a smelter, you're using refineries, which will cost you obviously more power, more space, but I don't care much about that. It's not up to me to tell you guys how much power you should be using in your world. That should be a choice you have to make by yourself. Other than making copper sheets, you also need alclad aluminium sheets to make our 20 heat sinks. Now for this, you are going to need 34 copper ingots, which is made from 13.6 copper ore and 9.1 water. Again, you don't have to do this if you want, you just have to use a lot more ore than what you should really have to use. But that's completely up to you, again, if you want to save on power, if you want to save on space and resources. Next, you are going to need 100 aluminium ingots, which is made from 200 scrap, which is then made from 67 coal, 133 alumina solution, which requires 112 bauxite and 112 water, which is slightly cheaper than before. Moving on now from the heat sinks, we've got the high-speed connectors, and essentially, this is what's going to be causing most of the controversy for me personally. If it wasn't for the high-speed connectors, I would probably recommend this recipe, but there's a reason why I say probably and not definitely. And that's mostly to do with, well, it's actually quick-wire to be honest, because with the quick-wire you have to use 300 of these, which requires 60 Caterium ingots, which is 120 Caterium ore. There's many thousands of Caterium ore lying around in your map. If you've got tons of Caterium, you might want to consider this recipe. If you're running low on Caterium, I don't recommend this recipe. I'll talk a bit more about that though towards the end of the video, where I compare all 3 recipes up here, so make sure you guys do stay tuned for that. So that's the 300 quick wire sorted. 125 silica requires 75 raw quartz, which is quite a lot, and it doesn't even end there, because you also have to make 10 circuit boards to make the 10 high-speed connectors, which requires even more silica. Final thing you then need is the quartz crystals, 60 per minute to be precise. And again, it requires more raw quartz. And if I didn't use this water recipe, it would be way more raw quartz than just this. In total, this is what we are using. 112 bauxite, not bad at all. Almost 400 water, but again, it's not really that bad. It's very simple to get and to package. If you really want to, then transport it by trains or trucks or drones. It's fine. 67 coal per minute, which I believe is the lowest that we're going to see today. 41.2 copper, which again, I believe is the lowest that we're going to see today. Maybe the second lowest, in fact. Raw quartz is relatively high. 162 per minute. 166.2 per minute. Caterium, 120 per minute, which again is relatively high, but 0 iron ore and 0 crude oil. So that is our radio connection unit. We've still got one more alternate recipe to go though, which is the radio control system. And again, to make our 5 radio control units, we are going to need 100 aluminium casing, 16.7 circuit boards, 1.67 crystal oscillators, and 50 rubber. And we might as well start with this, since this is the reason why I keep having crude oil in the description of all of my recipes there. Because yeah, unfortunately, yeah, this uses crude oil and it's a bit of a shame. But in total, we're using a decent amount of crude oil, and that's mostly because of our 25 plastic. You don't actually need this much crude oil to make our 25 plastic per minute. What you could in fact do is consume 12.5 rubber and 12.5 fuel to then make 25 plastic, and then use the 25 plastic and 25 fuel to then make 50 rubber. So essentially, it's a 1:1:2 ratio, and you can keep doing this forever and ever until, of course, you run out of oil, or until, of course, you don't need any more rubber or plastic. With our fuel recipe, this is called diluted fuel. I've already made a video talking about this. Please do check it out because it's one of my favorite recipes in the game, and it saves you an absolute butt ton of crude oil, so it's fantastic. You also get a little bit of polymer resin, which does nothing in this recipe, and a decent amount of heavy oil residue, but again, these two, you're just not really getting a lot from it, so don't expect to be making much from these two items necessarily. Second thing you're going to need is the crystal oscillator. We've already spent some time talking about this today, so I won't spend too much time talking about it right now. This requires reinforced iron plates, which by this stage of the game you should be making a decent amount of anyway. Cable, which is a very simple recipe. And quartz crystal, which again is relatively simple but does unfortunately involve a decent amount of raw quartz. Thirdly, you're going to need almost 17 circuit boards per minute, involving even more silica, and our copper sheet recipe, which I think I've been over like about 12 times today, but there you go. It's another use of the copper sheets, which we're going to be needing quite a lot of in this recipe, it looks like. Despite that, the final thing we need is the 100 aluminium casing per minute, which is the same aluminium recipe we were using for the last couple of examples, which does actually give you 100 water for free, which is quite nice as a byproduct, I suppose. And you can use this 100 water back into here, which saves you, again, a decent amount of water, right? You also have to consume 100 coal, unfortunately. So, let's see what this looks like in total. We get heavy oil residue, water, and polymer resin as byproduct, which is decent. You then have to consume the most amount of bauxite, unfortunately, a decent amount of water, quite a lot of coal, the lowest amount of copper. So if you are desperately trying to save copper, which you might be, you might want to consider this recipe. We also use quite a low amount of raw quartz, a very low amount of iron ore, and a relatively decent amount of crude oil, but I wouldn't really recommend this recipe. And there's a reason for that, and let's discuss that right now. So, here are all three of our recipes laid out. Basic, radio connection units, and the radio control system. Let's go over all three of these things and see what they consume. So, in bauxite, this consumes 133.3 bauxite. This consumes 112, and this one consumes 167. So, for bauxite, the best recipe to use is the radio control unit. Regarding water, and this one's not really a massive thing, if I'm honest, this consumes 132. The connection unit is 385, and the control system is 283. So the control system is actually the best for water to be saved. And not to mention, you also can save an extra 100 by using this back into the system as well. Regarding coal, the basic requires 80 coal per minute, the connection unit requires 67, and the control system requires 100. So you actually save coal by using the connection unit. Moving on now to copper. This is 62.6 per minute. The connection unit is 41.2 per minute. And the copper over here for the radio control system is 25. So again, you are saving some copper, but in all honesty, all three of these are actually pretty good. Moving on now to quartz, and I think this is quite a big and quite an important category. For the basic radio control unit recipe, you are using 126 raw quartz. For the connection unit, you're using 166.2. And for the control system, you are using 61.2. So you're saving quite a lot of quartz with this one, and you're consuming the most the radio control unit. The last three categories, Caterium, Iron, and Crude Oil. This only involves a bit of iron ore. This involves no iron ore, but involves Caterium. And this involves no Caterium, but uses a tiny amount of iron ore and a decent amount of crude oil. So in total, when it comes to the best recipe, really, it's up to you. What are you trying to save? If you're trying to save on bauxite, don't use this. If you're trying to save on coal, don't use this. If you're trying to save on Caterium, don't use this. If you're trying to save on crude oil, don't use this. So, if I'm honest, it mostly comes down to these two for me personally. And I would have to say, again, it's mostly personal preference. This saves you on bauxite, it saves you a bit on coal, it saves you a bit on copper, but it consumes more raw quartz and Caterium, but it also saves you some iron there as well. So, the best recipe for me is most likely the radio connection unit, because it's just saving the resources I want to save. It is using a fair bit of Caterium, and it's using a fair bit of raw quartz, but you're making thousands of these in your world, so you should be okay. But there's nothing really wrong with the basic either. I would say though, if you are trying to save on some things like crude oil, for example, I don't recommend using this. But without further ado, thank you very much for watching. But before we go, a massive thank you to our members, Mau Mau, Skull and Hattie, Lo, Nitormal, Chaos Rising, Cutthroat Zoo, Yamikel, and Tio Rico.